Howdy, friends. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity. We're on part 36 today. We're looking at the time coming out of the golden age of medieval Christianity and now descending into a time of collapse. There are several conditions that are going on in this time that we have to look at in order to understand this time of collapse. One is the monetary economy. It has become a dominant factor towards the end of the Middle Ages. The bourgeois, and if you'll remember, the bourgeois just simply means those who dwell in cities. This is a new social class because these are the merchants that have come back into play. During the feudal time, there wasn't really a lot of trade going on. There wasn't really any monetary system to speak of. Now that's changed, and the bourgeois have come in. They've achieved greater power, and that's a result of credit systems, trade, and manufacturing going on at this time. The interests of the bourgeois were aligned with a strong centralized government. This put them at odds with the nobility. Now, the reason for this is pretty simple and plain. The bourgeois needed the market to continue to be strong. They needed trade to continue to happen in order to strengthen the ability of trade routes to be maintained and protected. They needed a strong centralized government. So they weren't going to be going along with the feudal system. They wanted that to end. They wanted the strength of a centralized government, and so they achieved a lot of power by helping to support the centralization of the government. And as a result of that, these rising monarchies developed into several modern states. We see at this time France, England, and the Scandinavian countries. They came along as the first of these developing nations. Eventually, Spain, Germany, and Italy came later. The formation of strong nations brought with it a rising sense of nationalism. This nationalism undermined the papal claims to universal authority. So people are now a lot more beholden to their country, to their nation. They are beginning to identify themselves as citizens of these countries. And that with that comes pride, and with that comes loyalty. And so as a result of that, the universal nature of the papacy is being in charge of not just the church, but also the state, is that time's going away. That universal authority is not going to be recognized anymore as these nations form, gain strength, and people become much more nationalistic. If the popes leaned towards France, which they did largely at this time, the English would disobey and oppose them. If a pope refused to bend to the interests of France, France simply elected a rival pope, dividing all of Europe. So you see there's a lot of turmoil we'll look at that's going on in the papacy at this time. Therefore, the papacy as an institution lost a great deal of its prestige and authority. Many began hoping for a reformation of the church that would come from sources other than the popes. So the papacy is going to take a big hit during this time for sure. The dominant political and military event of the 14th and 15th centuries was the 100 Years' War. And if you're doing your math, you'll notice by looking at those dates, 1337 to 1475, that this was over 100 years. It wasn't just right at 100 years, but still it was known as the 100 Years' War. Though basically a conflict between France and England, the war involved the rest of Europe in such a way that some consider it the first European war. So not the First World War, but definitely the first war that really involved the vast majority of the countries in Europe. Two events started the war. One was that Edward III of England claimed the throne of France. Yeah, that'll tend to get you into a war if you just say, well, I should be ruler of France too. And then the other part is France had as an ally Scotland. Well, England invaded Scotland, so France, as their ally, had to defend them. So this were a couple of the big events that started the war. Repeatedly, England invaded France. Throughout this 100 Years' War, it was England going into France. They would go in, they would win impressive victories, but then they would have to withdraw because of lack of funds or other factors as well, mostly lack of funds. And so this process just continued. It was cyclical. England would go in, win in a battle, but not be able to maintain their presence there in France. England gained the upper hand when Charles VI came to the throne of France. The reason for that is the new king showed signs of madness, and it became necessary to replace him. And during that power vacuum, there were warring factions within France, and that divided the country, and that gave England an opening to once again invade. So they came back in, and used this as an opportunity to get back into France and invade them. Charles VI eventually died, and his son Dauphin declared himself king and took the name of Charles VII. When that happened, there are already all these warring factions in France. They're not going to be behind Dauphin because he is the son of Charles, now calling himself Charles VII. And so he was besieged in Orleans, and he didn't have any hope of becoming ruler of France. It was very bleak. But then something happened that turned things for Charles VII. Actually, a couple of things. One was that his former enemies decided to support him now. His father was dead. They didn't have to worry about this mad king being in charge anymore. We supported Charles at first until he acted crazy. Well, now let's give his son a shot. So that was a big deal. But the other thing was Charles VII heard of a young woman from the village of Domremy, and it's somebody that I'm sure you've heard of, and that is Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc claimed that she had visions of Saints Catherine and Margaret and of the Archangel Michael, and that all three of them ordered her to lead the Dauphin's troops to break the siege of Orleans. Joan met with Charles, and she convinced him to trust her. She was sent to bring supplies to the city. That was kind of her first job. Can you break the siege and get supplies in? Because we'd really need them. And she accomplished this task, and so that gave her a little bit higher standing with Charles, so he sent her on a new mission to actually lead the troops. Eventually, the siege was broken, and Joan earned the name the Maid of Orleans. So this woman comes in. Nobody really believes her at first. Charles, we don't know what he thought about her. Maybe he just wanted to listen to a crazy story, but she's able to convince him that what she said is correct. And so he gives her a job. Go get some supplies in here. She did it. Well, now lead my troops. She did it. And the siege was broken, and this made a huge change. Following this, the course of the war changed. Charles went to rest and was crowned king. Joan wished to return home. She wanted to go home. She thought she had done her job, but she's kind of like a good luck charm at this point. The king's not letting her go. He's not going to allow it. Well, she gets captured and was sold to the English, and this king who owed a lot to her, that didn't want to let her go, that wanted to keep her around for his luck charm, whatever you want to say, he didn't even bother to negotiate a ransom. Just, well, the English got her. Nothing we can do about it. Let's move on. That's a pretty sorry thing to do. The English sold her for 10,000 francs to the Bishop of Beauvais. He wished to try her as a heretic and a witch. So the religious powers that be weren't really crazy about the things that Joan of Arc was saying, and they wanted to get their hands on her, and they did. During the trial, Joan was accused of heresy for claiming to receive orders from heaven, for insisting the orders were given to her in French, and for dressing as a man. So those three things were what she was accused of. It was bad enough that she said she was getting orders from heaven, but oh man, the fact that they told them to her in French was even worse. They couldn't believe that. And then dressing as a man as a result of her being involved in the military. And that's what she did. So they accused her of those three things. She agreed to recant. After a long period of trial, she agreed to recant, but she said she had another vision, and Saints Catherine and Margaret visited her again and rebuked her for her recantation. So she went back on it. I can't recant. So as a result of that, she was taken to the old market square in Rouen and burned alive. 20 years later, Charles VII entered Rouen and ordered an inquiry, which found Joan innocent, of course. And in 1920, Benedict XV made her a saint. So very famous Joan of Arc. She did have a part to play in this history and in the ability for Charles VII to become king and maintain power. She wasn't really treated very well by even the people that she was supporting, much less the religious figures that got their hands on her. But she still made a great difference, and she's known to this day as a result of that. I do want to stop here with our history part, and I guess this is history too in a way. I want to recommend a film for you. This is a film called The Passion of Joan of Arc. It's one of the best films ever made. You can read up on it and find that it's very highly thought of by movie critics and those who have seen it. It was filmed in 1928, and I highly, highly recommend it for a couple of reasons. One, it's a tremendous film. The performances in it, especially of Joan of Arc herself, are absolutely amazing. But also, they used the actual trial transcript. They wrote down everything that was said in the trial, and they used that as the basis for the script. So if you watch the movie, you'll actually get to see the words of that were spoken during that trial. It's very authentic. Now, let me just say this as well. I said see the words, and I didn't misspeak. This is a black and white film that was a silent film. So you're going to be reading it rather than hearing it. Now, I know right off the bat, 95% of you just said there's no way I'm ever watching that, and that's fine. But if there's one or two of you that do, it's an excellent film. You will get a real sense of maybe what that trial was like. You'll at least see an actual transcript of the words. You'll see the words on the screen or what were spoken there, and you'll get a real sense and idea of what went on with Joan of Arc. And again, I think if you are inclined to watch this, that you would really, really enjoy it, and I highly recommend the film. Moving on then, the war, of course, had a lot of effect on the church. The long war had several important consequences for the life of the church. Since, during part of the war, the popes resided in France, the English began to see the papacy as their enemy. So this begins that break that's coming after the Protestant Reformation, in which England is going to completely break away from the Roman Catholic Church. But the cracks are forming now, because during this time, the papacy largely resided in France. And if you're at war with France, then you're not going to look at very favorably on a group that decides to go to France and move there. So the English begin to see the papacy as their enemy. That's a big blow for the church. Later, during the Great Schism, which divided the Western Church between two rival popes, nations chose allegiance partly based on the side they took during the 100 Years' War. So even the breakdown that's going to come when there's a split in the church that's just around the corner, it's going to largely be based on whose side you were on during the war. So, of course, that's a big effect on the church as well. In France, England, and Scotland, the international conflict strengthened nationalism, and as a result, weakened the claims of the papacy to universal authority. We already talked about this, but that growing sense of nationalism is going to limit the church. It's going to put the church down at a lower level. Country then becomes more important, and you have these nationalistic people no longer willing to say that the Pope not only has all of the religious power, but also all of the civil power. They're not going to accept that. And so that's going to limit the authority of the Pope as well. And another big factor at this time, you probably, if you know any of your Middle Age history, we're probably waiting for this one to come around. That is the bubonic plague. The Great Plague of 1347 set the stage for the life of the church during the latter part of the Middle Ages. With trade having improved greatly at this time, the plague moved quickly from the Black Sea to northern Europe. So we know that the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, came along from that area that had opened up trade in the east, and it kind of moved on with the trade into Europe, and it eventually went from northern Europe to the entire continent. Over 3 years, the plague swept over the entire continent and decimated the population. There are actually those who estimate that even as much as 1/3 of the population dies. Absolutely devastating and amazing to think of that many deaths happening from this plague, but those numbers are at least by some thought to be correct. Economic consequences, including unemployment and the elimination of entire markets, helped create political turmoil and riots. So this is a time in which the economy is not doing great, society's not doing great, there's a lot of unrest. It's going to actually take several centuries for Europe to completely regain stability as a result of this time. Because of the growing fear of imminent death, many went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Rome, or other more local shrines. What people started to see was it wasn't just the old and sick that were dying, it was the young people that were dying. And if you start thinking that every breath I take might be my last, every day I live might be my last, I've lost my young wife or I've lost my young children, when is my time coming? Then you might begin to think of things that you put off as something you would do one day, or something that you would want to do as a religious act of devotion. I better not wait to do that. I better do that now. And so as a result, we begin to see some religious effects that people are taking more seriously what they consider to be their faith. And one of the ways they expressed that was to go on these pilgrimages. Another way was the veneration of relics. So superstition increased and the veneration of relics gained momentum. I need something in my life to keep me safe. What am I going to get? Is there any medical thing that can help me? Not really. None of it's working. There may be some things that people are suggested that they do, but it's not helping. People are dying anyway. Well, maybe if I got one of it, maybe if I had a piece of the cross and I kept that close to me, that would protect me. Kind of like some kind of a shield from a lucky charm or something like that. If I had some part of the body of one of the ancient prophets, a bone or a tooth or whatever, let me keep that on me. That's going to protect me. People thought that way and they were scared. And so as a result, they started to move towards the relics. And of course, a big market for those came about and the market was flooded with them. Some observed that Jewish neighborhoods seemed to be more immune to the plague. Fearful, ignorant, and bigoted, many in the Christian population began violently attacking Jews, accusing them of having poisoned the wells in Christian communities. And so even some of these Jewish people were physically attacked and killed. Now, you may be thinking, well, what is this about? Why would the Jewish communities be less affected by the bubonic plague? Don't know for sure. Don't even know the numbers on that. It may have just been a perception issue, but there's one thought that I came across that seems to make a little bit of sense. The Jewish population tended to have more cats. Now, I'm sure from your history that the bubonic plague was spread by fleas, and fleas tended to come in on rats. So if you have a community that has more cats, what are you going to have less of? You're going to have less rats. Now, the next logical question of that is, why would the Jewish community have more cats than the Christian people? Well, there was superstition once again. Don't forget that. And one of the superstitions was about witches. And what do witches like to have around? Well, for them, they thought cats. So cats were looked at not desirably because in some way they were associated with witchcraft. Crazy stuff. Think of the ramifications of this. If this is actually correct, if this is actually true, then a crazy superstition that there are witches living among us, which there weren't. And not only that if anybody had a cat, they were a suspect of being a witch. So nobody had cats. That led to possibly the spread of the bubonic plague being even more severe, because if there had been more cats around, there would have been less rats. So the Jewish community not having this superstition, they had the cats there. Maybe that was killing the rats in their community and keeping the fleas from coming in, and it preserved their lives. Again, it's somewhat speculation, but it does seem to make some sense. And it also shows you the foolishness of superstition and how you can adversely affect yourself in a way that you wouldn't even think possible, just by thinking something crazy about witches and cats. But anyway, regardless of that, for whatever reason, it was perceived that these Jewish communities were doing better than the others, and people couldn't handle that. And so they just said, well, the Jews they're poisoning our water. That's why we're dying. So let's kill them first. And that's what happened in a lot of places. It was also during this time of collapse that the Byzantine Empire came to an end. On April 7, 1453, Muhammad II laid siege to the city of Constantinople. On May 29th, the city fell, along with the last remaining portion of the ancient Roman Empire. So now, finally, we said, all along that the Byzantine Empire is going to continue on in the Roman Empire in the East for another 1,000 years past when it fell in the West. Well, that time has now come to an end. It's over. Constantinople has been taken. The capital of the Byzantine Empire is gone, and that's the end of it. So that happened at this time as well. So another downer collapse type event happening during this period of history. Now we need to look at these popes. Talked about how the papacy's authority and prestige has gone way down. So let's look at this in more depth. Boniface VIII was elected pope in AD 1294. His former diplomatic career made him well at home with the intrigue of European courts, and as a result of that, he did enjoy success early on in his reign as pope. But in 1300, things began to change. Relations with France grew tense. Philip IV, who was the king of France, confiscated ecclesiastical lands, and the correspondence between France and Rome basically devolved into just them insulting each other. Boniface's response to all of this was the bull Unum Sanctum. I actually quoted that last episode. That's the one where he basically claims that the Pope doesn't just have unlimited religious power, but he also has unlimited, unchecked, universal civic power. And he claimed that. He claimed universal powers for the Pope. At a session of the French States General, William Nogaret accused Boniface of being a heretic, a sodomite, and a false pope. One of the things you're going to find throughout these years of people accusing each other of bad stuff is they always throw sodomite in there. I don't know why that is. I guess that's just the worst thing they could think of anybody being. But for whatever reason, you got that one. You might get a bunch of other stuff, but you're going to get that one for sure. And France didn't respond real well to this pope, and they didn't have a good relationship. In response, Boniface prepared a bull of excommunication to be issued on September 8th. Unfortunately, word got out that it was coming, and the French decided that they would infiltrate Italy and kidnap the Pope on September 7th to keep him from announcing the bull of excommunication. They struck first, and they captured him. They humiliated him. They rode him around on a horse. I think he was sitting on it backwards or whatever, and just made a big spectacle of him. He was humiliated, and as a result of that, the Pope lost many supporters. And even though Boniface was soon freed and the French were expelled from Italy, the damage had been done. Boniface never regained respect as Pope, and he died soon after. So the next Pope was Benedict the 11th, but he died after a short reign. He didn't last very long. That brings us to Clement V. He was the candidate from the pro-French party, and he was elected Pope. During his entire reign, Clement did not visit Rome even once. He stayed in France, and he stayed under the thumb of King Philip. So the French decided, we're going to fix this Pope thing. We're just going to take the Pope on as somebody that supports us, and we're going to keep him in check. And they did that. Clement named 24 cardinals during that time, and all but one of them were French. So put a lot of French support in the church, higher echelons of leadership. Several of them were also his relatives, so we got a little nepotism going on there, and nepotism is plaguing the church during this time, and it's going to keep on plaguing it up through the 16th century. Clement slowly undid all that Boniface had done, and those were policies that would be along the lines of supporting the French, and he sided with the French all the way through this. It was also under Clement that the Templars were arrested and tried. Remember, this is the monastic order, but they were a warriors' order. They were one of the groups that went over to the Holy Land during the Crusades. Well, that time is over now, so there really wasn't anything for them to do, but they had accumulated a lot of wealth and a lot of land. And King Philip of France decided that the Templars needed to go, and he decided they needed to go because he wanted to get their wealth. And so he made a big power play, and Clement, unfortunately, went along with it. All the Templars in France were unexpectedly arrested, and they were tortured. And some, under that torture, were forced to confess that they were a secret order opposed to the Christian faith. Even to this day, there's a lingering idea that the Templars were some kind of a secret order involved in conspiracies and all this stuff. They had knowledge. All of that is just nonsense. It all came about as a result of this, and the only reason for any of these accusations whatsoever was so that King Philip could get their money. That's it. So if you want to go along with those crazy theories, then I guess have fun with that. But the truth is, this was a great injustice that was done to these groups. Instead of supporting the Templars against these false accusations, their leader, the Pope, Clement, had all of the Templars who had not been in France arrested. So he said, well, guess what? Not only am I not going to help the ones of you that are in France, I'm going to round up everybody that's ever been a Templar, no matter where you are, and we're going to arrest you too. King Philip and Clement then came to an agreement. The Templars would be abolished, and the property they held would be transferred to another military order. But the wealth of the Templars went primarily to Philip. So Philip got what he wanted from Clement, drug this group through the ground, made them be disbanded, eliminated, whatever, and all of it done just so he could get a hold of their money. And he did. He accomplished it because of this weak pope. Clement V, whose reign was a blight on the papacy, but also a sign of things to come, died in 1314. So he started a trend that's not great, and it's going to go on for a while. So let's look at a few more of these. The next pope was John the 22nd, and he developed an elaborate system of ecclesiastical taxes which produced widespread resentment. So another guy was just trying to get it in your pockets, and he did, and he established the system of taxation. Benedict the 12th had a great palace built in Avignon. Refusing to return to Rome, he also took the side of the French in the war, alienating England and the empire. So Benedict had this beautiful palace built in Avignon, and that's where the popes primarily stayed during this time. They didn't go to Rome. They didn't go back. They had a nice place in France. They had French support, and that's where they stayed, and that alienated these other groups, particularly England, who was at war with France. Clement VI continued favoring the French. His reign was also marked by nepotism, so that continued nepotism that's going on during this time. Innocent VI began making arrangements to return to Rome, but he died before this could be accomplished. So Innocent thought, you know what, we need to get back to Rome. Things are not going real well, and we need to get out of France. And so he started the process, but then he died, so he couldn't see it to completion. But then Urban V actually returned to Rome in 1365, and everybody was happy. He was joyously received. Unfortunately, he soon returned to France because he was unable to hold the loyalty of his Roman subjects. Things didn't go well in Italy. When he came back to Rome, it had been a long time since the popes had been there, and he didn't get the support he needed, and so he went back to France. That brings us to Gregory XI. He was the next one, and it was during his reign that Catherine of Siena called the Pope to return to Rome. In 1370, having received a vision, Catherine began a campaign to have the papacy return to Rome. And so she was a big advocate for this and probably did have some effect in helping this to happen. And then on January 17, 1377, Pope Gregory returned to Rome. The long stay in France was disastrous for the papacy. Seen as a foreign power, the nationalism of European countries led to resentment of the popes. Being in France and being allied with France really hurt the authority of the popes throughout the rest of the nation. And it didn't help in France either because they were kept under the thumb of the ruling party. So it was a bad deal, and that long stay in France was really bad for the papacy. Practices of simony, pluralism, absenteeism, and nepotism caused many to lose respect for the Pope and the Church. Calls for reform of the Church also included attempts to limit the power of the popes. So you probably wonder what all these words mean. A couple of them we've already been through in this study, but I'll remind you, simony was the selling of church offices. That question had been answered, and it had been forbidden years ago, but it had come back into practice now. Pluralism was the idea that you could hold more than one church office. So these church offices were very lucrative, and people figured out, well, if I can get my hands on one, that's great. But if I can get two or three, I'm going to get a lot more money. And so people would be named in these church offices in multiple capacities. And that leads to then absenteeism. Absenteeism is holding an office but not really being able to be there to fulfill the obligations of that office. And you can see how that can happen. If you're the bishop of a church in France and the archbishop of the churches in England and a bishop of a church in Germany or whatever, an area, you've got three different roles. You're getting the income from three different places, but you can't be in three places at one time. You can't really do the duties of those three places at the same time. So you're getting the income, but the positions are really not filled. And as a result of that, the work of the church is not being done. So it really, really hurt the church. And then we've already talked about nepotism, which is just to name family members into powerful positions in the church. And that caused a lot of people to lose respect for the leadership in the church, the upper leadership, obviously starting with the Pope. And there began to be this cry for reform. We see this coming. Cracks have formed. The authority, the power of the church is going down. And the respect for the church is going down. And there's become an idea in the people that there needs to be reform, and it can't come from the upper levels of church leadership because they're the ones that are needing to be reformed. Where is it going to come from? That leads us in again into the Protestant Reformation that's coming. We also need to cover one other area, and that's the Great Western Schism. Gregory the 11th died, and that left the papacy vacant for somebody to come in. The people of Rome, afraid that a new pope would return to France, they didn't want them going back to France. A mob invaded the conclave meeting that was set to elect a new pope, and they remained there, demanding the next pope be a Roman or at least Italian. So the people said, you know what? We're not taking any chances that this pope's going to come along and run back to France. So we're coming into the meeting, and you can elect whoever you want to, but they better be Roman or at the least Italian, because we want to make sure they're staying here. And they didn't leave until they made sure that happened. And so therefore the new pope was Italian. Urban VI was crowned on Easter Sunday, AD 1378. Well, Urban was really set on reform. He was a guy that was going to come in and clean things up. But he was maybe a little bit too much set on reform. He lashed out against absenteeism and simony. He planned to elect a number of Italian cardinals in order to wrest power from the French. So he was going to pack the cardinals group with his people. That'll take away the French's power, because then there'll be equal numbers. Well, for whatever reason, unfortunately, he chose to announce his plans before actually implementing his plans. It's never a good idea to let your enemies or people that are going to oppose you know what you're going to do before you actually do it. It didn't go well to him. Though he was implementing the reform many wanted, Urban's actions led to reports that he had gone mad. People started saying, this guy's crazy. I mean, he's getting up in the pulpit, ranting and raving. He is going after people. I mean, he is naming cardinals left, right, and sideways. There's something wrong with him. So even though he was doing what people wanted, the way he was doing it turned them off. And not only that, he also continued appointing relatives to important posts. So he was continuing this practice of nepotism that people didn't like. He was trying to get rid of and clean up some things, but then his hands were dirty on that. So people started to get very concerned about the Pope. Well, many French and Italian cardinals fled from Rome. When they found out his plans, that he announced what he was planning to do, they got out of there. And they decided, we got to get a new pope. This guy is crazy, and he's not doing what we want. In fact, he's going to hurt us. So they just simply declared that Urban was a false pope elected by coercion. Now, understand, you can make that claim, but there was never, before all this heated up, nobody ever made that claim before. None of these guys were sitting around saying he's false, we need to get rid of him. It only happened as a result of them feeling threatened. So it's convenient that they've got this little excuse to fall back on, but it's not probably really all that genuine. And anyway, they didn't care about that. They wanted to get a new pope, and however they could do it, that's what they went for. So Urban responded by appointing 26 new cardinals from among his supporters. So they got rid. He just said, all right, you don't like me, I don't like you, I'm getting rid of you. I'm going to name some new supporters. Well, those cardinals that he was replacing said that the cardinals that Urban brought in were not legitimate because he's a false pope. On and on this went. And the same cardinals who had elected Urban now came together to elect a rival pope. That was Clement VII. Now, you know from the study, there were several times there were rival popes. That's nothing new. But this was the first time in church history that the actual group of cardinals that elected one pope came together and elected a second pope. So it was always some other group that did it. It wasn't the same ones. It would be another country or another ruler or whatever it was. This is the first time that you actually have the exact same people electing two rival popes. Never happened before, and it created a great split. And now there's two popes, one in Rome, one in France, and each seeking recognition of the various courts of Europe. So they're going to go out and try to get support from the different nations. Clement VII gained support from France, obviously, and then their ally Scotland, as well as Castile and Aragon. Urban VI received support from England, France's enemy, makes sense, Scandinavia, Flanders, Hungary, and Poland. Germany was a little bit split. The emperor favored Urban, but many of the nobles and bishops took the side of Clement. So there was a split there. Portugal just kept on, he would change sides repeatedly. It would move back and forth. Italy was split. You may be thinking, well, they would have gone for Urban, the one in Rome. Well, that wasn't necessarily Correct. The nation itself was not united. So there was a split there. The powerful kingdom of Naples would change sides repeatedly. So that was unstable. When Urban died in 1389, his cardinals elected Boniface IX. When Clement died, Benedict VIII was elected. So this didn't end when those rival popes passed on. It just kept going because these are factions in the church. It's not just about the popes. Boniface IX was followed by Innocent VII and finally Gregory XII. In September 1407, Benedict VIII and Gregory XII agreed to meet, but they never did. They decided they were going to meet. Let's meet and hash this out and figure it out. Well, they didn't ever meet. They always found a reason they couldn't. Well, finally, weary of the situation, the Roman cardinals broke with their pope and began negotiations with the French party. France then withdrew support for Benedict, and efforts began to end the schism. This brings us to the conciliar movement and efforts for reform, and those are just around the corner. So our next episode, we're going to look at this conciliar movement, the movement to bring everybody back together to fix this schism and be united again. But also in that, there is a definite growing sense that there has to be some reform. Things can't keep going this way. So we see these seeds. We've seen it all along, but we see even more. These seeds are starting to take root and grow. And there's a growing feeling that not just let's get back together and everybody's happy and keep on going business as usual, but there's got to be some big changes, and it's got to come from somewhere other than the upper echelons of the church leadership. So that's what we'll be looking at next week. Thanks once again for joining me for this edition of the History of Christianity. I hope that you have a wonderful week. Thank you for your time. Hope to talk with you again next week, and God bless.